It's hard to imagine, but in 1989, Chinese relations with the outside world seemed perhaps as optimistic as ever. Rajiv Gandhi arrived in Beijing for the first visit by an Indian leader in 34 years, and Taiwan had even dispatched Finance Minister Shirley Kuo to Beijing for the Asian Development Bank conference. Over in the US, Deng Xiaoping's old friend, George H.W. Bush, was new to the Oval Office. Bush was America's chief diplomat to China in the 1970s, and Deng had successfully negotiated with Bush when he was Reagan's vice president. Yet by June, everything fell apart. The Tiananmen Square Massacre saw the world turn on China overnight. Congress demanded punitive sanctions, Australian Prime Minister Bob Hawke publicly wept as he read out the details.
Were slaughtered as mercilessly as the many wounded soldiers from other units there.
And America's major news networks aired more stories on China within a month than the entire 2 decades previously. For Bush, he was in a perilous situation. Was he to oppose the fury of his own people, or was he to undo 2 decades of diplomatic work? The stakes couldn't have been higher.
Hello there.
Okay, so when it comes to high-stakes historical diplomacy, we usually think of, say, Stalin and Roosevelt at Yalta, or Kennedy and Khrushchev during the Cuban Missile Crisis. But I'd like to put forward George H.W. Bush and Deng Xiaoping into that mix. With perhaps the exception of Gerald Ford or Warren Harding, Bush was the most forgettable 20th century president. Imagine being the leader of the most powerful country in the world, yet when your name is Googled, you don't even show up as the top result. But his presidency was far from insignificant. Sino-US diplomacy had come a long way since Nixon's visit in 1972. Trade was normalised, and tourism had actually become so regular that in 1985, approximately 1.4 million foreigners visited China, and nearly $1.3 billion was earned from that tourism. Compare this to 1971, when the People's Republic was not even recognised as the real China by the USA, and from when China was shut off from the outside world.
How do I know which one to shoot? What? How do I know which one is the real dad? We never switched. We don't even look the same. All right, when's my birthday? Ah, crap. February 8th. Ah! Dad!
And so Bush had a tough line to toe. The public and Congress were furious with China and wanted to see harsh sanctions, yet if Bush came down hard on China, relations were back to square one, and as one Cold War was ending, a new one with a growing China would be on the cards. And yes, you're allowed to comment, but they're in a Cold War now anyway. But the point is that this was the exact outcome Bush wanted to avoid. And like I said at the start, Bush and Deng were old friends. They'd been dealing with each other for 2 decades and had a shared agreement that both nations were better off as allies than as enemies. Whereas Congress was pushing for harsh sanctions, Bush came out and said that he did not want to punish the Chinese people for the actions of the government. He attempted to phone Deng Xiaoping, but Deng didn't respond.
Let us play with him. This is hilarious. Oh, we were playing phone tag.
Now, this sounds sketchy and sounds like China were trying to pass the buck, but it was simply not the practice of Chinese leaders to answer phone calls from foreign leaders. It just wasn't something that they did. Unable to reach Deng by phone, Bush penned a letter to the old man. I'll leave a link to the letter in the description below, but basically Bush argued that America was a country founded on the principles of freedom and democracy, and so Americans viewed everything that happens in the world through that prism. He stressed that he didn't want to arrogantly force America's beliefs onto others, but that freedom and democracy were beliefs that Americans considered to be universal. Bush's recognition of how America came across was more important than we might imagine. The Chinese perception of the West was and still is that they were decadent with their freedom and arrogant in their belief that democracy was the only viable political system. Interestingly, the G7 Economic Summit was to take place a month after Tiananmen, and there was much discussion as to how to handle China. Along with Japan, Bush pressed the case for milder sanctions, but knew that he had to still be punitive. Effectively, China was sanctioned by the suspension of all military sales to Beijing, meaning that they lost most favoured nation status. Most Western media today has criticised Bush for a soft approach, but these sanctions were not insignificant on China. America supplied China with avionics equipment, missiles and torpedoes, F-8 fighter planes, and Sikorsky Black Hawk helicopters. Worse still was that China had already paid for all of these and was still awaiting some of the parts. Effectively, they felt as though they were scammed.
Hey, it's me. Knock knock. So, you got my money?
So, in order to preserve the relationship, Bush knew he had work to do and so sent National Security Advisor Brent Scowcroft and Assistant Secretary of State Lawrence Eagleburger on a secret mission to China. As a side note, how patriotic is the surname Eagleburger? And if you've been following the series, you might recognise that this was the 3rd set of secret negotiations between America and China for fear of public backlash. Deng warmly welcomed them, but made it clear that China was willing to face the sanctions and weren't going to go on an apology tour for the use of deadly force. As the negotiations played out, Deng made 4 main conditions. Firstly, he agreed to allow Fang Liji, an outspoken advocate of democracy and critic of China, to take asylum in the USA. At this point, Fang was residing in the American embassy in kind of a Julian Assange-like situation. In return, he wanted the USA to lift some of its sanctions against China, and for them to join in partnership on either one or two economic projects. Importantly, by this point in history, Jiang Zemin had been groomed for succession, and in the same way that Deng had visited the States in 1979 to begin the normalization of relations, Deng wanted to secure a visit for Jiang to ensure the continuation of relations. Scowcroft and Eagleburger said no worries, and that was that.
You were right about one thing, Master. The negotiations were short.
Except, not really. Though Deng warmly received Scowcroft and Eagleburger, he preferred to do his negotiations with former leaders like Nixon and Kissinger, and then Leonard Woodcock, who served under Carter. Now, this might seem bizarre, but Deng was coming from a country who at that point had no concept of term limits. In fact, Deng actually gave his list of demands to Kissinger to then relay back to Bush. And it wasn't until May of 1990, nearly a whole year after the Tiananmen Square incident, that the negotiations with Bush began to be settled. Bush announced that Fang Li was coming to the USA, and that China would be given most favored nation status once again. But the public was furious. From their point of view, the idea that Americans would secretly meet with communists who massacred their own was treason.
Oh, come on. I'm not a bad guy.
With the most favored nation status once again being extended to China, they sold China 3 satellites and supported World Bank loans for humanitarian purposes. In return, China announced the lifting of martial law and released 573 detainees who had been held since the Tiananmen Square Massacre. Bush also issued Executive Order 12711, which deferred the deportation of Chinese nationals to 1994, and then in 1992 this was made permanent. Also, in 1992, Chinese Premier Li Peng visited the United States and restored much of the relationship. Bush's foreign policy is generally regarded as pretty good, especially in comparison to his son. But most would say that his response to Tiananmen Square was his blemish on an otherwise good record. I'm going to argue the exact opposite. Diplomacy is about what can be practically achieved. Sanctions are only useful if the government you're sanctioning is afraid of being sanctioned. If not, then the people of that country simply suffer without any concrete change. If Bush had pursued a more aggressive foreign policy, the alienation of China would have created huge issues. By this point, China was far from what it is today, but its trajectory was clear. The 1980s showed the world that the sleeping giant of history had awoken, and so if Bush pressed any harder, 2 decades of negotiating work would have been undone, with no change achieved, and America's Cold War with China would have been fast-tracked by a couple of decades. It's also important not to project the present onto the past. Yeah, the situation between China and America looks destined for war, but that wasn't an inevitability following 1990. A lot has happened in these last 3 decades, much of which we'll cover in the next few weeks, but events from the 1990s to today have moved the two to a much more likely chance of war. Bush dialed those tensions back when a hawkish approach wouldn't have achieved anything. But unfortunately for Bush, he was a one-term president, and in 1992, he was booted out by Bill Clinton. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel, and make sure to leave a comment with your thoughts on George Bush. Outside of the issue with China, what do you think he was like as a president? I'm keen to hear it. We'll see you next time for our next venture into a fascinating part of history.